The grand chambers of the Xylosian High Council shimmered with a soft, ambient light reflecting off the polished synth crystal floors and the intricate, spiraling architecture that seemed to reach for the very stars. Here, silence was not merely the absence of sound, but a cultivated presence, a testament to the Xalus's mastery over their environment, and more importantly, their own minds. For generations, their civilization had evolved beyond crude, physical expressions, embracing instead the elegance of psionic communication and the boundless energy of the cosmic ether, viewing brute force as a relic of a forgotten, less enlightened past. Princess Lyra, poised at the center of the vast chamber, felt the familiar hum of the planet's core resonate through the floor, a soothing frequency that always calmed her before significant duties, and today was undoubtedly significant, for she was to be joined in a political alliance with a species as fundamentally different from her own as starlight was from shadow, humanity. Initial reports had described them as comparatively primitive, creatures bound by their physical senses, lacking the subtle psionic presence that was the very foundation of Xelosian societal structure and true galactic diplomacy, a species whose very existence seemed to hinge upon the tactile and the visible, their conflicts often resolved with what the Xylos quaintly referred to as kinetic exchanges. Lyra, in her ceremonial silks that flowed like liquid starlight, maintained a facade of serene composure, yet beneath it a polite, almost imperceptible amusement flickered, a quiet condescension for this union, which felt more like an act of benevolence than a genuine partnership, a necessary gesture to bring a nascent race into the galactic fold. Then he arrived. Ambassador Kale, her intended, stepped from the short-range transit portal, a stark silhouette against the shimmering energy, and in that instant he seemed to confirm every initial Xylosian assessment. He was unassuming, dressed in simple, functional, diplomatic attire that contrasted sharply with the ethereal gowns and robes of the Xylosian delegation, and his form, while robust, lacked the graceful, almost translucent quality of her own people. His movements were direct, devoid of the flowing elegance and nuanced psionic signals that permeated Xylosian interactions, and he spoke with a clarity that bordered on bluntness, a straightforwardness that the Xelos found oddly quaint, almost childlike in its lack of subtlety. He possessed no discernible psionic signature, his mental presence a blank slate compared to the rich tapestry of thoughts and emotions that usually resonated from other species, and he relied instead on a small, archaic data slate, a flat, inert device he held firmly in one hand to review notes or access information, a stark contrast to the Xylos's instantaneous neural uploads and shared consciousness. Throughout the lengthy Xylosian marriage rites, which involved intricate energy transfers and profound mental communions, Kale remained eerily calm, almost passive, his gaze steady, his features betraying nothing but a quiet focus, an unnerving stillness. Lyra observed him closely, noting his utter lack of fanfare, his quiet dignity, and his curious habit of observing everything around him with an intense, almost analytical gaze, as if cataloging every detail of the elaborate ceremony. She couldn't fathom how such a physically oriented species, one so seemingly lacking in the higher mental faculties that defined true civilization, could ever truly contribute to galactic harmony beyond being a mere strategic buffer against less refined threats. She believed him to be a symbolic gesture, a minor liaison to a race yet to truly mature beyond their planet-bound squabbles and the seemingly simplistic notions of individual action. Days bled into weeks following the initial ceremonies, and Princess Lyra settled into the familiar, dignified rhythm of her royal duties, with Ambassador Kale, a quiet, often overlooked fixture by her side. He rarely engaged in the intricate Xylosian courtly rituals, which involved complex psionic debates over philosophical concepts or the nuanced interpretation of ancient energy patterns, or the profound mental communions that were the very lifeblood of her people's social and political interactions. Instead, Kale spent his days observing, a silent sentinel in the midst of the bustling, mentally vibrant court. He would often pose surprisingly pointed questions, delivered in his simple, direct manner, about the Xylosian imperial power grid, delving into the intricacies of their energy distribution and consumption, or inquiring about their logistical chains, tracing the pathways of supplies and resources across vast distances. He also requested access to the detailed historical records of past conflicts, particularly those involving physical skirmishes with other primitive species, questions Lyra and her peers often dismissed as rudimentary, almost simplistic, given their advanced predictive algorithms and automated defense systems that could anticipate threats light years away. More than once, she found him meticulously studying their orbital defense protocols, even requesting detailed schematics of their intricate energy barriers and weapon arrays, a request Lyra found particularly odd. Why would a species so reliant on crude, kinetic weaponry and ground-based skirmishes be interested in their elegant, energy-based defenses designed for high-level tactical engagements? She mused that perhaps it was a primitive fascination with technology beyond their grasp, a simple curiosity, or perhaps he was merely trying to understand his new, vastly superior allies. Lyra found his directness occasionally jarring, his pragmatic inquiries a stark contrast to the poetic and philosophical discussions that usually filled her days. Yet there was a strange, almost unsettling focus in his deep-set eyes that belied his outwardly plain demeanor. She sometimes overheard him, a faint resonance reaching her through the palace's intricate sound-dampening fields, engaging in vigorous, almost aggressive, physical training routines with a small human security detail in a designated, isolated area of the palace, an open space that the Xylos normally used for energy meditation. The sounds were guttural, the movements swift and impactful, alien to the Xylos, who cultivated mental agility and psionic prowess over physical strength, seeing the latter as inefficient and barbaric. She readily dismissed it as a crude cultural quirk, a remnant of their distant, violent past, convinced that such physicality held no true value in the enlightened galactic community. Yet a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of curiosity began to stir within her an illogical, almost primal draw to this alien display of raw, physical energy. Meanwhile, across the Xylos Empire, subtle energy fluctuations were detected on the far reaches of their territory, anomalies that initially appeared insignificant, mere cosmic background noise or minor stellar disturbances, easily dismissed by the Xylos's automated defense systems, which were optimized for known and predictable threats. Their algorithms finely tuned to identify only sophisticated, technologically advanced aggressors. But Kale, in his quiet observations, in His seemingly simplistic reliance on empirical data, rather than solely on complex algorithms, seemed to notice something else. His gaze would often drift to the distant tactical displays, a subtle tightening around his eyes, as if discerning an unsettling, repeating pattern that eluded the advanced sensory networks of the Xylos, a pattern hinting at an approaching storm that only a mind unburdened by assumed superiority might recognize. It was not simple, Lyra would eventually learn, but merely profound in ways her people had yet to comprehend, a quiet storm gathering just beyond her perception. Weeks bled into months following the initial ceremonies, and Princess Lyra settled into the routine of her royal duties, her days filled with the intricate dance of psionic diplomacy and the serene management of Xylosian society, with Ambassador Kale a quiet, almost forgotten fixture by her side. He rarely engaged in the profound mental communions that were the very lifeblood of Xylosian interaction, nor did he participate in the complex, energy-based courtly rituals that defined their political landscape. Instead, Kale spent his days in constant, almost unnerving observation, his gaze sweeping over details that Lyra and her peers considered utterly mundane or primitive, focusing on the very physical infrastructure of their world, the intricate network of power conduits that hummed beneath the synth crystal city, the waste disposal systems that efficiently recycled every particle, the delicate balance of their atmospheric processors, and even the paths of their automated water purification vehicles. All systems the Xylos had perfected to such a degree that they were simply taken for granted, managed by unseen, perfect algorithms. He inquired deeply into their logistical chains, asking pointed questions about the flow of nutrient paste to distant agricultural domes, the emergency transport routes for civilian populations, and the precise coordinates of strategic resource storage hubs, questions Lyra's aides found bafflingly simplistic, beneath the dignity of a galactic ambassador. Yet Kale pursued these details with an unwavering focus, meticulously noting down information on his archaic data slate, a device that seemed laughably crude compared to the Xylos's neural interfaces. He continued to pore over detailed historical records of past conflicts, not just the grand psionic wars of Xylosian legend, but also the ancient, brutal skirmishes with less evolved species, focusing on what he called kinetic engagements, battles that involved physical impact and crude weaponry, a concept as foreign to Lyra as breathing vacuum. Yet he seemed fascinated by the inefficiencies, the brutal effectiveness, and the sheer unpredictability of such primitive warfare. Lyra often overheard him asking his Xylosian liaison, a young, earnest aide named Tyron, questions about how Xylosian structures would fail under sustained physical impact, or how their energy shields would respond to kinetic overload concepts. That made Tyron's psionic presence ripple with confusion, as if Kale were speaking a forgotten, barbaric language, and Tyron would patiently explain the Xylosian energy dampening fields and regenerative properties, convinced that Kale was simply struggling to grasp the superiority of Xylosian technology. Lyra's initial dismissal of Kale's eccentricities slowly began to morph into a subtle, almost begrudging curiosity, a tiny seed of unease taking root in her otherwise perfectly ordered mind. She found herself unable to completely ignore his unwavering focus, his relentless pursuit of what seemed like irrelevant data, and she even considered for a brief moment assigning a more senior aide to assist him, hoping to satisfy his peculiar, almost primitive curiosity, but decided against it, deeming it an unnecessary allocation of resources. Yet the reports from Tyron continued to be perplexing, detailing Cale's increasingly odd requests, not just for schematics, but for thermal signatures of structural weaknesses, for vibration patterns of ground vehicles, for stress points. On the outer hull of the capital city's primary defense dome, information that Xylogene architects and engineers had long optimized out of their designs, seeing them as theoretical impossibilities in their perfect systems. She began to observe him more consciously, not just as a passive symbolic figure, but as an enigma. She noticed the unsettling intensity in his eyes, a depth that seemed to absorb every detail, to calculate every variable, and the surprising precision in his movements, even when simply walking through the palace halls or gesturing during quiet conversation, a subtle grace that belied his outwardly robust form. She found herself on a few occasions attempting to probe his mind psionically, a natural Xylosian impulse to understand and connect, only to find nothing, an absolute void, a complete absence of the familiar mental resonance that flowed from all other sentient beings, which was in itself an anomaly that caused a flicker of genuine apprehension within her, a silent alarm bell that she instinctively tried to quell, attributing it to his species' primitive development. Her curiosity was further piqued by Cale's continued, almost relentless physical training. The sounds from the isolated training area, a large open space normally used for deep energy meditation, now echoed with rhythmic thuds and sharp exhalations, alien sounds in the quiet, mentally attuned palace. Lyra, during her regular energy walks, found herself involuntarily pausing as she passed the reinforced doors, catching glimpses through the polarized viewport of Cale and his small security detail. They moved with a chilling efficiency, their bodies compact and powerful, engaged in movements that were foreign and unsettling. Rapid, fluid strikes against heavy, suspended targets, complex patterns of evasion and attack, their forms dripping with sweat, their faces set in expressions of fierce concentration. The raw power, the sheer physical exertion, the deliberate impact of fist on padded surface, all seemed so barbaric, so fundamentally inefficient, compared to the elegant, instantaneous psionic projections of her own people. She saw the quiet coordination between Cale and his human guards, a silent language of nods and subtle shifts in posture, demonstrating a bond forged not through mental communion, but through shared physical exertion and unspoken understanding. She dismissed it as a crude cultural quirk, a remnant of their distant, violent past, convinced that such physicality held no true value in the enlightened galactic community. Yet a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of apprehension stirred within her, a visceral response that she, a being of pure intellect, found deeply unsettling. It was not just a quirk. It was a fundamental difference, a primal force she found herself unable to fully dismiss, even if she didn't yet grasp its terrifying purpose. A sense of unknown potency, a latent capability, seemed to radiate from him, a quiet hum of danger. She couldn't quite place, but increasingly couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, the anomalies that had first appeared as minor energy fluctuations on the far reaches of Xylosian territory were becoming more frequent, more distinct, their patterns subtly shifting, growing bolder yet still. The Xylosian High Command, steeped in millennia of technological superiority and a profound belief in the infallibility of their predictive models, continued to dismiss them as environmental noise, minor stellar phenomena, or uncalibrated sensor readings. Kale, however, was increasingly agitated, his quiet demeanor now laced with a subtle urgency. He would politely but firmly try to bring attention to them during council meetings, presenting crude, yet remarkably clear, data visualizations on his archaic data slate, pointing out repeating signatures, unusual energy spikes, and trajectories that defied known cosmic currents. He spoke of gravitational distortions, phantom signals, and unregistered mass signatures in a tone that suggested imminent danger, patterns that the Xylosian predictive models designed to filter out any data deemed irrelevant or anomalous to their highly advanced threat profiles, simply ignored, deeming them statistical outliers. His warnings, delivered with quiet conviction, were met with polite condescension. Xylosian scientists and strategists, confident in their advanced algorithms that had always provided ample warning of any credible threat, would patiently explain away his concerns with complex scientific jargon, detailing how their systems factored in every variable, how their shields were impenetrable, how their foresight was absolute. They assured him that any real threat would be detected far in advance, giving them ample time to react with their customary grace and precision. The suspense was a palpable, silent hum in the very air of the council chambers. The reader knew Kale was right, and the Xylos, blinded by their own technological hubris and intellectual arrogance, were utterly, tragically blind to the true nature of the approaching danger. Kale would simply nod, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, his gaze distant, as if seeing beyond the shimmering displays into a future the Xylos refused to acknowledge. A disquieting possibility began to form in Lyra's mind, perhaps Kale's. Observations and primitive training were not quirks, but preparations, a silent, meticulous gathering of knowledge for an inevitable confrontation. She caught him once in his private quarters, sketching tactical diagrams on a transparent data pad, diagrams that were shockingly effective in their brutal simplicity, depicting choke points, flanking maneuvers, and direct assaults that had no place in Xylosian warfare. She overheard him muttering terms like breaching, suppression fire, and attrition warfare, concepts that were alien and disturbing to the Xylos, words that spoke of a raw, desperate struggle for survival, rather than the elegant, bloodless engagements their history records. His unseen depth was starting to reveal itself, not as intellectual brilliance, but as a different kind of wisdom, born of struggle and harsh reality. The story spiraled towards an inevitable climax, as the Xylosian people remained utterly oblivious, wrapped in their bubble of technological confidence, while Kale's quiet observations and ignored warnings pointed towards an undeniable, growing threat, a shadow rapidly expanding from the void, a threat that was not simply sophisticated, but devastatingly, fundamentally different. And soon that difference would collide with Xylosian complacency, and Kale's true nature, his terrifying, unseen depth, would be revealed in a blaze of desperate, brutal glory, leaving Lyra to question everything she had ever known about power, survival, and the deceptively simple man she had married. The subtle energy fluctuations that Cale had warned about, dismissed for so long as cosmic background noise or minor anomalies, were now impossible to ignore, blossoming from faint whispers on the far reaches of Xylosian territory into blaring, undeniable alarms that shrieked across every sensory node. Within the High Council chambers, painting the crystalline walls with urgent, flashing red warnings. No longer were they mere statistical outliers, but massive, undeniable energy signatures, manifesting too quickly, too close, for any Xylosian algorithm to process or predict. The sleek, elegant Xylosian vessels, designed for precision strikes, and graceful retreats reported impossible speeds, objects appearing out of nowhere, bypassing the long-range scanners that had always served as the impenetrable first line of defense for millennia. Then, with a terrifying, instantaneous jump that defied all known Xylosian FTL physics, the rogue, aggressive fleet, identified now as the Vorlag hegemony, erupted into the inner systems, appearing almost simultaneously in multiple key strategic locations, their ships dark, brutal masses against the vibrant cosmic backdrop, their sheer numbers suffocating the light of distant stars, their presence a grotesque stain on the Xylosian-controlled space. Their arrival was not merely sudden. It was a devastating, chaotic maelstrom, a hurricane of unrefined, kinetic force unleashed upon a civilization accustomed only to the elegance of energy manipulation and the subtle dance of psionic warfare. The Vorlag bypassed the Xylos's predictive models not through superior technology, but through sheer, unthinking aggression, a brutal, overwhelming surge of power that shattered the very notion of ordered combat, rendering their advanced threat assessment systems obsolete in a single, terrifying instant. The sophisticated Xylosian defense grids, designed to intercept and neutralize threats with surgical precision, found themselves utterly overwhelmed, their elegant energy projections buckling and failing under the relentless, crude, but ceaselessly applied brute force of the invaders, their beautiful, intricate shields flaring and dying against the ceaseless barrage of kinetic projectiles and crude, explosive warheads. The Xylos, accustomed to wars of meticulous calculation and strategic psionic attacks, where conflicts were resolved with minimal energy expenditure and no direct physical contact, were now confronted with a tide of pure, unthinking aggression that simply crashed through their refined defenses, their automated systems, optimized for known and predictable threats, struggling, then failing, against the relentless, almost mindless, shock tactics of the Vorlag. Panic, a rare and unwelcome guest in the serene, logical minds of the Xylos, rippled through the High Council chambers, a wave of raw, unfiltered fear that shattered the usual psionic calm, disrupting the delicate balance of their collective consciousness, causing disarray among the usually unflappable strategists who now found their mental disciplines crumbling under the weight of such an unexpected, overwhelming assault. Princess Lyra, despite her own courage, her inherent strength of will, felt the suffocating dread of her people's terror, a visceral fear she had never known, for she had always lived in a world where their superior technology and intellect handled all threats with quiet efficiency, where danger was an abstract concept, analyzed and neutralized before it ever touched their reality. During the emergency council meetings that followed, the chaos only mounted, the voices of the Zilosian generals and counselors rising in discordant psionic screams, their mental projections flickering with despair as more and more sectors reported critical breaches, their perfect systems failing, their elegant strategies proving useless against an enemy that did not engage in strategy but simply annihilated. Kale, however, remained unervingly calm amidst the rising tide of fear, a silent anchor in the storm of panic, his posture unwavering, his gaze fixed intently on the constantly updating tactical displays, absorbing every agonizing detail of the unfolding catastrophe. He stepped forward, his voice steady, cutting through the wailing disarray of the council, his tone clear and unhurried, as he began to point out critical flaws in their defense distribution, highlighting choke points in their orbital network that the Vorlag were exploiting with terrifying efficiency, and identifying vulnerable infrastructure that the Xylos had overlooked due to their absolute reliance on a perfect system that assumed a thinking, logical enemy. He spoke of flanking maneuvers and sustained suppressive fire and hard targets and kinetic vulnerabilities, terms that were alien and jarring to the Xylos, concepts from a world of brutal, physical combat that their refined minds had long discarded as obsolete, and his suggestions